Our hero was hunting on a ranch in South Texas many years ago and was driving to his blind in the afternoon after dropping a couple of other hunters off at their respective deer stands. Well, as it sometimes happens, nature called while he was driving. So he pulled over to the side of the road, walked a short distance into the bush, and squatted down and began to take care of his business. As he was doing so, he caught some movement out of the corner of his eye. He was on a small rise, and something just seemed a little out of place down below him. The object moved again as he focused on that spot, and that is when he realized he was looking at the front half of a very nice buck peeking out of the bush about 150 yards away. As quickly and quietly as he could, he grabbed his rifle, chambered a round, and crept to where he had an opening in the brush to shoot from. Fortunately, the buck hadn't noticed him, so he wrapped his arm through the sling, dropped back down into a squatting position, took aim, and squeezed the trigger. That buck dropped instantly at the shot, and it just so happens he was using one of the cartridges I will discuss in today's episode about the various 6.5 millimeter rifle cartridges. So what cartridge was he using? Stay tuned to find out. Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 398 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. And in this episode, I will talk about all of the 6.5 millimeter SAAMI standardized rifle cartridges. And I will also discuss a few noteworthy CIP 6.5 millimeter rounds as well. And as always, I'll talk about their history, design characteristics, performance specs, strengths and weaknesses, and their recommended uses in detail. And where appropriate, I will also share some personal anecdotes involving these rounds, as well as some observations involving some of these cartridges by various noteworthy gun writers as well. Though they have been fairly popular in Europe and elsewhere, 6.5 millimeter cartridges were not extremely common choices by hunters in North America until pretty recently. Now, as we'll discuss later in this episode, there were several abortive attempts to introduce various 6.5 millimeter cartridges in the USA during the 20th century that just never took off for one reason or another. But when things changed on that front, they changed fast, and 6.5 millimeter cartridges are now incredibly popular among North American hunters. So why did it take so long to catch on? There's a lot of theories as to why that is the case, one of which is that metric cartridges in general just were slow to catch on with American hunters. 30 caliber, 270 caliber, 25 caliber, 35 caliber, all those were much more common bore diameters with American hunters really through the first half of the 20th century. 6.5 millimeter and 7 millimeter cartridges were much slower to catch on. Some people used them for sure, and 7 millimeter certainly caught on before 6.5 millimeter, say with the 7 millimeter Remington Magnum just exploding in popularity in the 1960s. So the metric designation of this bore diameter certainly had something to do with it. And as we'll talk about here shortly, a couple of the at least initially more popular 6.5 millimeter cartridges in the United States did not use a metric handle in their name. So that general American reluctance to use the metric system probably had at least something to do with it. Now, the fact that a literal communist and one of these rounds were involved in the assassination of a U.S. president during the Cold War in the 20th century certainly didn't help things on that front either. And in addition to those things, I think there were also some more mundane explanations as well, which I will also discuss. I want to make one last point before we get started. I want to state that I am not trying to insult or offend anybody with anything that I say in this episode. So I want to clarify something. When I say that cartridge X has Y advantage over cartridge Z, that's what I mean. I am not saying that cartridge Z is garbage, that you should throw your rifle in that chambering away, and that you're stupid for ever using it. Now, furthermore, that advantage or edge cartridge X has might be a big advantage. It might be a small advantage. It might be a significant consideration for the sort of hunting you do, or it might not. And finally, just because cartridge X has this advantage or that advantage, or that it's better in this situation or that one, does not mean that cartridge Z or any other round won't also work just fine in said situation. And of course, you are also welcome to agree or disagree with anything I say in this episode. And like I say, I'm just calling things the way that I see them. So let's get started. Buckle up, folks, because this is going to be another good one. Now, believe it or not, the story of 6.5 millimeter cartridges begins with the humble 6.5 by 52 millimeter Carcano round, also known as the 6.5 Mannlicher Carcano. This round was developed in the late 1800s by the Italians for their 1891 Carcano rifle. Now, the Italian army used various versions of this rifle with the 6.5 Carcano round through the end of World War II. Now, it came along around the same time, but actually a little bit before the 6.5 by 55, and it used a very similar overall design principle with a rimless case firing smokeless powder. It was also one of the very first cartridges designed from the start to use smokeless powder. This rifle was also noteworthy in that it used what is called gain twist rifling. That is not a common feature on small arms. It's more common on larger caliber military guns. But long story short, a rifle with a gain twist like that will start out with a slower twist that gradually speeds up as you go farther down the barrel. The idea is this allows you to use a faster rifling twist rate without putting as much initial strain on the bullet and having a little bit less pressure to start out with. Well, the Carcano rifle started out with about a 1 in 19 twist rate, which is pretty darn slow, but then that eventually sped up so that it was about a 1 in 8-inch twist rate towards the end of the barrel. I've heard specifics are 1 in 19 and a quarter inches at the beginning and 1 in 8.25 inches at its fastest point. Now, people will often speak derisively about the Carcano round and rifle it is associated with. I remember asking my dad about it, back when I was a kid. Hey, what's the deal with the 6.5 Carcano? And his initial response was, the rifle's a piece of junk. You don't want to mess with that, yada, yada, yada. I think that criticism is a little harsh looking back on it, but you got to remember this is a very old rifle and cartridge design. Remember, older than the 6.5 Swede. This thing is old. It's certainly not the greatest in the world, but that rifle and cartridge were a serviceable pairing for a long time, and they still work okay today. Another interesting thing about the 6.5 Carcano is that it was designed to use .267 caliber instead of .264 caliber bullets like just about everything else I'm going to talk about in this episode. Now, you can shoot .264 caliber bullets in the Carcano, but accuracy may suffer if you do that. And I think that probably at least partially explains some of the criticism of the rifle and cartridge. The initial military loading for the round was a 162 grain full metal jacket fired at around 2,300 feet per second. This is a low pressure, lower performance cartridge, but in conjunction with that, recoil is also surprisingly mild too. We'll talk more about this other round later, but the 6.5 Carcano had very similar ballistic performance to the 6.5 by 54 Mannlicher Schonauer cartridge. And like the 6.5 by 54, the 6.5 Carcano also had a very distinctive shape because it used such a long, heavy bullet. PPU actually still makes 2 factory loads for it to this day. One is 123 grain soft point at 2690 feet per second. The other is 139 grain full metal jacket at 2525 feet per second. That works out to a 291 yard maximum point blank range on an 8-inch diameter target with that 123 grain soft point bullet. That load is just fine for deer, antelope, hogs, and the like. Now, the biggest thing this cartridge had going for it was you could get rifles and ammo in the USA for really inexpensive prices in the 1950s and 1960s. Just to pick a year at random here, let's just say 1963. That has some special association with this cartridge, as you'll learn here in a second, but it also happened to be the last year, Winchester made the Model 70 in its old configuration before they changed the design. In 1963, you could get a standard grade Winchester Model 70 in a cartridge like 30-06 for about $150. And you could get a standard Remington 700 in something like 30-06 for about $125. Now, the Western Cartridge Company had a contract to produce lots of 6.5 millimeter Carcano ammunition for the Italian Army after World War II. But the Italian Army ended up switching over to other firearms instead, and so all of those rifles and ammunition that they used or were getting ready to use got dumped on the surplus market, especially in the United States. Well, a man named Lee Harvey Oswald bought one of those surplus rifles and some of that surplus Western ammo. Perhaps you've heard of this guy. Well, buying that rifle with a scope attached to it, including shipping, cost him less than $30. So less than 1/5 of the price of a Winchester Model 70 at the time. Unfortunately, this is what this cartridge is best known for. It's the rifle cartridge Oswald used to shoot President Kennedy in 1963. Now, the official story from the Warren Commission was that Oswald fired 3 160-grain full metal jacket rounds loaded by the Western Cartridge Company at Kennedy from the 6th story of the Texas School Book Depository in Dallas, Texas. He missed with his first shot. The second shot hit Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally. That's the so-called magic bullet. That bullet inflicted a serious injury to Governor Connally that he ended up surviving. That was a possibly fatal wound to Kennedy, but we will never know because he was shot in the head a few seconds later. The Warren Commission says Oswald shot Kennedy in the rear of the head with the third and final shot with the .6.5 Carcano. Some people agree with this assessment. Other people do not. Now, I made a Patreon post on this incident earlier this year, and I shared a compelling argument by a medical doctor who has treated numerous gunshot wounds inflicted upon soldiers in World War II, to include treating some American soldiers shot by Italian troops using the .6.5 Carcano round. This same doctor studied the Kennedy assassination in detail, and he wrote a fascinating analysis of the Kennedy assassination from a terminal ballistics perspective. That is what I have shared on Patreon. And long story short, he agrees with the Warren Commission and presents evidence why he thinks Oswald acted alone and how the wounds inflicted upon Kennedy and Connally are consistent with the conclusions of the Warren Commission. Now, I am not completely sold on his conclusions, but it is interesting and well written nonetheless. Now, specifically, the thing I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around is that this doctor and the Warren Commission said that the bullet fragmented when it hit Kennedy's skull. Now, I admit that is certainly possible. But the thing that gives me pause is that he was shooting a 160-grain full metal jacket bullet, and that bullet is not too dissimilar from the bullets Karamojo Bell used to great effect on elephant from the 6.5 by 54 millimeter Mannlicher Schonauer. We'll talk about that here in a minute. It's just a little hard for me to wrap my head around that a bullet that performed so well and had such a great reputation on deep straight line penetration on elephant would break into pieces and completely fragment when striking a thin human skull, especially when the range that this occurred at with the Kennedy assassination was longer than what most shots on elephant were, too, and the bullet would have been going slower, a little bit slower in this case. Now, like I said, I concede this is certainly possible, and there could also be a reasonable explanation for this, too, right? It could be those bullets Oswald was shooting had a thinner jacket or were made from a different material from those guys were hunting elephant with way back in the day. In this same vein, Stephen Hunter, he's the author that wrote the book Point of Impact. That's the book that the movie Shooter, starring Mark Wahlberg, was based on. Well, Stephen Hunter wrote a book called The Third Bullet. He released it in 2013. That was around the 50-year anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. This is a work of fiction, but Mr. Hunter presents an alternate theory for the assassination involving both Oswald shooting that Carcano and another shooter using another 6.5 millimeter cartridge I also talk about in this episode, and that other shooter uses that other cartridge to deliver the final fatal headshot on Kennedy. Remember, that's a book, it's a work of fiction, but Stephen Hunter does know guns, and he tends to talk about them in a realistic way in all of his books. It is an entertaining read, if nothing else. I have put a link to that Patreon post I just referenced and a link to where you can buy that book in the episode description. That's enough about the 6.5 Carcano. Let's move on to the 6.5 by 55, also known as the 6.5 Swede or the 6.5 Swedish Mauser. Though the 6.5 Carcano is older, the 6.5 by 55 is much better known. And this was actually the first 6.5 millimeter cartridge to catch on in the USA. Now, sort of like the 9.3 by 62, the 6.5 Swede has a strong association with Mauser, but it was not designed by Paul Mauser or anyone else at the company. This cartridge, the 6.5 Swede, was the result of a joint effort by the United Kingdoms of Sweden and Norway to build a new rifle cartridge for their respective armies. It was released in the mid-1890s. The Norwegians used it in their Krag Jorgensen rifle. The Swedes used it in the Mauser 1896 rifle, hence the Mauser Association. It was not the first, but it was among the very first cartridges designed from the start to use smokeless powder. And it was developed as part of a trend towards smaller caliber and higher velocity cartridges using smokeless powder and jacketed bullets designed for use in a bolt-action rifle. For what it's worth, official SAAMI designation of the round is the 6.5 by 55 Swedish. This cartridge has a rimless design, .480 rim diameter, 55 millimeter long case, overall length of 2.955 inches. This is an in-between round that's longer than short-action rounds like the .308, but a little shorter than the .30-06. It also has a slightly fatter case than the .30-06 family of cartridges. It has a SAAMI spec 1 1/8-inch twist rate, 51,000 psi max average pressure. CIP specs are similar, but not exactly the same. That actually has a 1 8.66-inch twist rate, or 1 220 millimeters, just over 55,000 psi max average pressure. So it is loaded a little bit hotter according to CIP standards versus SAAMI standards. Now, the 6.5 Swede has an unusual size, right? Like I said, slightly different case head and rim diameter. That's a little different than the .30-06. It's also just in that in-between space between short and standard actions. But that said, the 6.5 Swede also has a roomy case that provides a lot of flexibility. Now, case capacity is one lever, so to speak, you can pull to affect ballistic performance. Pressure is another. Now, even though the 6.5 Swede is a lower pressure round compared to more modern cartridges, it has a pretty large case capacity. That counteracts that lower pressure to a certain degree. That larger case capacity and faster twist rate the cartridge has also make it more compatible with heavier bullets. And that is a big part of why this cartridge is still around today and is in somewhat common use. Now, the initial military loading for the 6.5 Swede, 156 grain round nose full metal jacket at 2379 feet per second. That was out of the 29-inch long barrel of the 1896 Mauser the Swedes used. They later switched over to another load, 140 grain full metal jacket at 2625 feet per second out of the same rifle. Interesting performance, not too dissimilar from another 6.5 millimeter round we'll talk about later. Now, the 1896 Mauser had a 1 7.87-inch or 1 200 millimeter twist rate. This cartridge ended up turning into sort of the Scandinavian .30-06, and it became darn popular among sportsmen in Norway, Finland, and Sweden. Now, companies like Norma produced high-quality hunting ammo for the cartridge too, and they continue to do so to this day. And a lot of other companies besides Norma make 6.5 Swede ammo. And while it was probably most popular in Scandinavia, it was also darn popular in the rest of Europe, too. Now, some people ask, why wasn't this cartridge more popular in the USA? There's a saying I love from back in my Army days. Amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics. Here is a blurb from the book Any Shot You Want from the 6.5 Swede section. Although Swedish Mausers began trickling in early, the 6.5 by 55 never took off here in spite of its unquestioned virtues. First of all, the Model 94 and 96 Mausers did not lend themselves to serious customizing. Even though they were beautifully finished military rifles made to the highest standards of Swedish gunmaking by companies like Husqvarna and Carl Gustaf, the cock-on-closing feature, lack of a safety lug, and excessively long striker throw and lock time all conspired to keep Swedish Mausers as utility camp rifles and not much more. Even if you spend $1,000 to make one over, what you end up with is a $1,000 utility camp rifle. Ammunition was also hard to come by. No American company loaded it until very recently, so the main source was Norma and occasionally RWS or DWM. All were expensive, but you had really no choice because of the base dimensions of the 6.5 by 55 are larger than the 30-06 case head size. It was unsafe to make cases from any easily obtained brass. It can be made from 270 or 30-06 brass, annealing, die forming, trimming, chamfering, full-length resizing, then fire forming, but that is a bit of an operation for most hand loaders, and it still leaves a marginally safe case with a short reloading life. It was hardly worth the trouble. Because of the older design of the 94 and 96 Mausers, most hand loaders, including your obedient servant, were reluctant to push loads very far. There was something tremendously reassuring about that Mauser 98 safety lug when you were pushing the envelope, and the Swedish rifles do not have it. As well, they were designed to work with pressures of around 46,000 CUP, which is pretty modest if you are seeking high velocities. Okay, so that was Terry Whelan from Any Shot You Want talking about the 6.5 Swede. Now, he goes on later in that discussion to talk about how much he did like the cartridge for what it was good for. He said the rifles he had in it were always very accurate, they didn't recoil very much, and they worked just fine out to 300, maybe 400 yards. But it just wasn't capable of achieving safely, anyway, the velocities he was looking for to extend that range. That was especially true compared to other cartridges you could get much more readily in the USA, like the 270 or the 30-06. So if you compare everything he just said about the 6.5 Swede to the American 30-06 in the United States, you have the 30-06 available in the Springfield rifle, which was based on the Mauser 98. That is a wonderful, very flexible rifle. It lends itself well to customization. It's also a more modern rifle design that is also quite a bit stronger than those older Mausers. Now, while it is the case now that you could get rifles from Tikka or modern production Mauser rifles in 6.5 Swede, that are much stronger than those older Mausers and can safely handle hotter 6.5 Swede loads. It just wasn't the case back then, and American hunters ended up using stuff like the 30-06 and the 270 in those early days in the 20th century. Those cartridges got established because you could get a 30-06 in a surplus Springfield. You could also get it in something like a Winchester Model 54, later the Model 70. You could also get it in rifles from Remington, etc. And you also had a lot of ammo support for those cartridges from companies like Remington and Winchester as well. Now, like I said, that's changed. You can get good quality 6.5 Swede rifles today. 6.5 Swede factory ammo, reloading components are all much easier to obtain now than used to be the case. Now, in terms of hunting, the 6.5 Swede is right at home, I think, as a medium game cartridge. Deer-sized game, similar-sized African antelope, blesbok, impala, gazelle, and the like. No reason you can't use it on bigger game, elk, kudu, bear, whatever. Plenty of Scandinavian moose have been taken with this cartridge over the years. Now, the nice thing about this cartridge with its lower operating pressure is it has a pretty long barrel life. Depending on the quality of your barrel and how hard you run it, the Hornady spreadsheet I'm looking at has it with a barrel life approaching 6,000 rounds. Now, the 6.5 Swede, most common in European rifles like Mauser, Tikka, Sako, Blosser. Remington did make some rifles in this chambering, so did Winchester. I don't think they do right now as I record this, but I know Ruger has made rifles in 6.5 Swede as well. It's one of their rotating chamberings. They don't always make rifles in it every single year, but at least here in the last couple of years, I want to say they made the Hawkeye African in it. I know they've also made the #1 single shot in 6.5 Swede too. And of course, in addition to all that stuff, you can find it in surplus Mausers and the like. The 6.5 Swede is not a super popular offering in North America, but it's certainly out there. Federal, Hornady, Swift, Norma, HSM, PPU, Lapua, S&B, Remington, Winchester all make factory loads for the 6.5 Swede. For instance, Federal makes a couple different loads, right? They have 140 grain Fusion at 2530, 140 grain Power Shock at 2650, 156 grain Fusion at 2500 feet per second. Those are not the only offerings, of course, but those are generally typical ballistics and bullet weights you see for 6.5 Swede factory loads. Now, interestingly, Norma offers a load in their Bond Strike line with 143 grain Bond Strike going 2723 feet per second. .629 G1BC for that bullet. And my goodness, that sort of performance sounds almost identical to a certain other 6.5 millimeter cartridge we'll talk more about later. So while the 6.5 Swede is often associated with stuff like a 156 grain soft point bullet, which you can still get, you can find it in the lighter stuff as well. You can get copper bullets in it too. And that faster twist rate it is spec'd with also makes it compatible with heavy high BC bullets too. That's not necessarily something the designers of the cartridge planned on doing, right? That you look at those old factory loads that they had for the military, that 160 grain bullet was just a plain old round-nosed projectile. But the fact that it was built in the way that it was made it perhaps unintentionally forwards compatible with stuff that would come out over a century later. Now, I can't bring up a certain newer 6.5 millimeter cartridge without all the 6.5 Swede guys coming out of the woodwork and saying that their cartridge will do everything that this newer round will do. They're not necessarily wrong in saying that, but unfortunately the 6.5 Swede never did catch on in North America. It's certainly in use. I'd say it's probably in the top 5 6.5 millimeter cartridges people use here in terms of popularity, but it's still in a clear tier below a couple of other rounds in terms of popularity. But all told, awesome design. Speaks well of the guys who initially built it in the 1890s that it's still hanging around today. Now, for reference, max point blank range of 310 yards for that high BC Bond Strike bullet I just mentioned, 281 yards for that plain old 140 grain soft point bullet. And one last thing, the 6.5 Swede also has a reputation for excellent inherent accuracy. It's not quite on the level of some of the newer cartridges I will discuss later in this episode, but once again, absolutely outstanding in this area, especially considering how old the design was. And competitive shooters, especially in Europe and particularly in Scandinavia, used it with a lot of success in rifle matches. That was especially true, say, in the beginning of the 20th century, but its use in competitive shooting does still continue to this day. Next up, we have the 6.5 by 57 millimeter. This is literally a 7 by 57 millimeter Mauser, neck down to 6.5 millimeter. This was a Paul Mauser invention in the mid-1890s. Not a super popular cartridge, though it is CIP standardized and it is still in use. PPU makes ammo for it, 139 grain soft point at 2591 feet per second. There is a very similar cartridge called the 6.5 by 57 millimeter R. This is a rimmed variant of that 6.5 millimeter cartridge used in break action, single shot rifles, and in combination guns. And as is the case with those sort of cartridges, it's generally loaded to lower pressures, and that's the case with this one. S&B makes 6.5 by 57 and by 57R ammo. Both loads use a 131 grain bullet at 2542 feet per second. All right, next up we have the 6.5 by 50 millimeter Japanese round, also known as the 6.5 Japanese. The Japanese military adopted this semi-rimmed cartridge in the early 1900s for their Type 30, Type 35, and Type 38 Arisaka rifles. This round was due to be replaced by the 7.7 millimeter Japanese cartridge, but both ended up being used quite a bit in World War II. The military load was 139 grain full metal jacket at 2,500 feet per second. And that particular bullet was known for rapidly yawing upon impact and causing pretty serious wounds on soldiers. I briefly mentioned this round in episode 328 where I was talking about 25 caliber cartridges. A lot of Japanese Arisaka rifles found their way into the USA at the end of World War II. Naturally, those who had those rifles wanted to shoot them, but it was hard to find actual 6.5 millimeter Japanese ammo. American gunsmiths came up with the idea to ream out the chamber of a 6.5 by 50 a little bit, then neck up a 257 Roberts case to use 6.5 millimeter bullets. Voila, you do that, you have a new rifle cartridge called the 6.5 by 257 that would safely function in those thousands of Japanese rifles, and it would work darn well for hunting medium game at short to moderate range. You would need to hand load, but the process of reaming out the chamber and making custom loads was a lot more simpler and straightforward than getting actual 6.5 by 50 millimeter ammo at the time. In fact, my dad shot his first deer with one of those converted rifles as a young man. We still have that exact rifle to this day. I think he said he used a hand load of a 120 grain Sierra bullet going 2,600 feet per second when he killed that deer. Fortunately, Norma makes factory ammo for the original Japanese round today. 156 grain bullet at 2070 feet per second advertised velocity. That's a big bullet going slow. Not quite sure why that factory load is going so slow, but my Hornady reloading manual has a 6.5 Japanese section in it with several loads for 140 grain bullets going about 2,600 feet per second. So once again, another round just right in that same general performance level that we've been talking about. Okay, next we have the 6.5 by 54 millimeter Mannlicher Schonauer. I mentioned this one earlier. This cartridge is also sometimes known as the 256 Mannlicher. Now, as a quick aside, this is an example of how you will sometimes see two different numbers that describe a rifle of the same caliber. You have a bore diameter of a rifle and a groove diameter of the rifle. And if you were just to take a cross-section of a rifle barrel and look at it, the bore diameter is the high point in the rifling, and the groove diameter is the deepest point the rifling is cut into the barrel. 6.5 millimeter cartridges generally have a .256 caliber bore diameter and a .264 caliber groove diameter, and they generally shoot bullets that are either identical to or very, very similar to the groove diameter of the rifle. So like I mentioned earlier, most of these rifle cartridges use .264 caliber bullets. But if you take 6.5 millimeters, convert it to inches by dividing it by 25.4, you will come up with .256. All right, let's get back to the 6.5 Mannlicher. This cartridge was developed for the Greek army. The Austrian army used it a little bit as well, introduced 1900. Initial load was 160 grain full metal jacket at 23 to 2400 feet per second. Like the 6.5 Carcano I mentioned earlier, this has a very long, skinny bullet. This cartridge used a 1 and 9 inch twist rate. PPU currently makes a factory load for it, 156 grain soft point round nose at 2395 feet per second. That works out to a 257 yard max point blank range. Now, like I mentioned earlier, that 160 grain full metal jacket was known for delivering deep, straight line penetration. This was actually Karamojo Bell's favorite cartridge to use on elephant. He described it as a wand-like Mannlicher Schonauer in 6.5 by 54 millimeter. He killed around 300 elephant with it. He stopped using it in favor of the 7 by 57 because he could get 7 millimeter ammo, but ran out of the 6.5 ammo. Here is a blurb about this cartridge from African Rifles and Cartridges by John Taylor. What must surely be the world's record bag with any rifle, much less a small bore, is held by the little 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Schonauer in the hands of Banks, recently retired from the elephant control staff in Uganda. 3 elephant with 1 shot. He shot 1, which fell against 2 others. All 3 of them tumbled over a precipice. Blaney Percival, who for many years game warden of Kenya, did most of his shooting with the 6.5 millimeter. It has always been popular with those who like small bores. Naturally, other than on head or neck shots, you could not expect the little rifle to drop animals in their tracks other than the very smallest species. It will kill anything, but as with all other small calibers, if the bullet is not vitally placed, there is no or little external bleeding, which frequently means a lost trophy. Let me quote from Banks, the greatest of all the exponents of the small bore. A lioness galloped across his front. He was carrying a 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Schonauer loaded with solids. I let drive at her, he writes, and she carried on as though untouched. I thought that I had missed her clean until I found her some way further on, stone dead. Search as I would, nowhere could I find either entrance or exit bullet hole, and it was not until she was skinned that I found the tiny wound channel through the kidneys. End of quote. So like I said, this cartridge offered outstanding penetration with that 160 grain full metal jacket bullet, but as you would expect from such a projectile, it just doesn't make a very large wound cavity. Now, of course, that would be different with a soft point bullet, for instance. It probably wouldn't penetrate nearly as well, but it would make a bigger wound. Now, this rifle cartridge had problems with reliability with some of the rifles, and John Taylor goes on to complain about some of those Mannlicher Schonauer rifles jamming at the worst possible time on hunts against dangerous game in Africa. Here's another story. On another occasion, Percival wounded a lion, which he had been driving out of some reeds. The lion charged, and Percival's rifle again jammed. His gun-bearer then lost his head and ran, and the lion, as almost invariably happens in the case of that description, brushed past within a couple of feet of Percival, who had remained like a rock and made after the fleeing boy. She, it proven to be a lioness, caught up with the boy and clawed him down, but fortunately died on top of him without doing any very great damage. But it was a matter of seconds. 5 more, and she would have killed him. So, as you can tell, John Taylor, not really a big fan of this cartridge, either the cartridge itself or the rifles it was available in, but, like I said, Karamojo Bell would disagree with that assessment. All right, moving on. We have the 6.5-06. This is literally a 30-06, just neck down to 6.5 millimeter. Now, the story of this cartridge begins in 1913, and we have a cartridge called the 256 Newton. Remember, same sort of nomenclature I talked about with the 256 Mannlicher Schonauer. The 256 Newton was very similar, used the same idea as the 6.5-06, but it was not interchangeable with the later 6.5-06 iterations due to differences in case length, shoulder angle, that sort of thing. A man named Charles Newton designed this cartridge and some other ones, and he was, unfortunately for him, way ahead of his time with some of his designs, and World War I kind of put a damper on things. He had some bad luck. And when I say ahead of his time, I mean several different things, but one of the big problems he had was there was a lack of slow-burning propellants that were appropriate for cartridges like the 6.5-06 to get the most out of them. Same was also true with the 25-06. And those cartridges existed in one form or another early in the 20th century, but they did not reach their full potential until after World War II, when you could get a good enough slow-burning powder, optimized for the burn rate necessary, for that case to really get the best performance out of it. Unfortunately for Newton, he had gone bankrupt long before that happened. The Western Cartridge Company did produce 256 Newton ammo until the mid to late 1930s, though. Now, there's a lot of ink that's been spilled over the years about the 270 Winchester and why it uses unusual 277 caliber bullets instead of more common 6.5 millimeter or 7 millimeter projectiles. Winchester made their decision for various reasons, but the fact that the 256 Newton was still hanging on by a thread in 1925 when the 270 came out, that was one of many reasons why they stayed away from the 6.5 millimeter bore diameter with it. Now, that abortive attempt at building an American 6.5 millimeter cartridge was also one of many reasons why it took so long for that bore diameter to catch on in the USA. The 6.5-06 hung around as a wildcat for many years until A Squared finally standardized it with SAAMI in the late 1990s. Now, that cartridge had a 1 9-inch twist rate, could launch a 140 grain bullet at about 2,900 feet per second. That is fantastic performance. It gave hunters everything they liked about the 6.5x55, but just with a little bit more juice, a little bit longer effective range. That works out to a 320-yard max point blank range, 140 grain interlock at 2,900 feet per second. And you could get that, push that range out a little bit farther with a higher BC round. 6.5-06 turned into a highly capable open country round. Unfortunately, there were a lot of fits and starts with it. It just never really caught on. Now, it has the dubious distinction of being a former SAAMI standardized round. Support for the 6.5-06 disappeared when A Squared went under in the 2000s, and if there's no company that is willing to continue to support a round for continual pressure testing and all of that stuff with SAAMI, well, they eventually drop it from their list of standardized rounds, and that's what happened here with the 6.5-06. Now, another problem with it was overshadowed by the 264 Win Mag when that round came on the scene in the late 1950s. Now, as you'll see, performance is pretty darn similar between those two cartridges, and I think the 6.5-06 would have done a lot better if the 264 Win Mag wouldn't have come along and taken a lot of that market share away from it. And the 264 Win Mag had the added benefit of being around that you could get from a giant company like Winchester with outstanding rifle and factory ammo support. Unfortunately, for those that like it, the 6.5-06 is basically a handloader only proposition today. Now, I personally have a 6.5-06 Ackley improved rifle, P.O. Ackley himself made for my grandfather in, I think, the late 1960s. That rifle is built around a converted Mauser action, and everything else about it is custom. Custom barrel with that custom chamber, Ackley cut for him, custom stock, custom triggers, all of that stuff. Now, that is a very common sort of conversion. A lot of those Mausers GIs brought home from Europe in World War II ended up as different 30-06 Wildcats. 6.5-06, 8mm-06, 338-06, 35 Whalen, whatever. Unfortunately, this was not the most successful Ackley improved round. And actually, some of Ackley's data from himself from the 1950s indicates faster velocities with the regular 6.5-06 over the Ackley improved version. But with a 26-inch long barrel and with more modern powders, you can squeeze out another 100 feet per second or so with a 6.5-06 Ackley improved. Juice just isn't quite worth the squeeze with it. Still a cool round, especially with my family's personal history with it. My grandfather loved that rifle. He shot lots of deer with it. And he was actually the guy I was talking about at the beginning of the episode. And yes, that really did happen. He was going to the bathroom and saw that deer and shot it with that rifle squatting there like that in South Texas. He also claimed one deer kill that he made at about 600 yards with that rifle too. He really liked hand loads with 120 grain Sierra bullets for use on deer. And I think that's all he ever killed with that cartridge. I'm sure he killed a couple of coyotes and things like that with it, but never anything bigger than deer. I'm not sure how fast he was getting those 120s going for him. I get the impression he was probably standing pretty hard on it. Now, this is an excellent example of the saying about the beware the man with one rifle sort of thing. Now, he owned more than one rifle, but this rifle was his baby. He did all of the work on it himself, aside from the work Ackley did on it with Ackleyizing the chamber, so to speak. He bought a stock blank for the rifle, did all of the woodwork and finishing himself. He bedded it, installed a dual set target trigger on it. Almost anything you can think of, he did it. It took years of work for him to put all of that stuff together. And of course, he hand loaded for it as well. Altogether, that whole combination just shot fantastic for him. I do have plans in the future to do my own hand loading for it and then take that rifle on a hunt somewhere and do a project with it. More to follow. This is, like I said, not in the near future. Now, moving on from the 6.5-06, we have the 264 Winchester Magnum. This was the first American 6.5mm cartridge since the defunct 256 Newton. Now, Winchester rolled out a whole new line of belted Magnum cartridges based on neck-down 375 H&H cases, shortened to fit in a standard-length rifle. Same as a 30-06 instead of a full Magnum-length action like the 375. 4.58 Win Mag was first, 1956. It was followed by the 264 and 338 Win Mag cartridges in 1958. 264 Win Mag has a 2.5-inch long case, 3.34-inch overall length, 64,000 psi max SAAMI pressure, 1 9-inch SAAMI spec twist rate. Initial advertised load, 140 grain bullet at 3,200 feet per second. And of course, Winchester offered it in their Model 70 rifle. Now, people hate on Hornady for their marketing today. Say what you will about them. They know how to get people to buy their products. Well, Winchester had that sort of reputation back then. They were a massive marketing machine, and they could plug almost any new cartridge right into their existing lineup and expect lots of sales. And for that reason, the 264 Win Mag was pretty darn successful right out of the gate. This was a long-range, flat-shooting cartridge, great for deer, antelope, and the like. You could certainly use it on bigger game, but I think it was perfect for deer-sized game in open country. Recoil, not too bad either. But then a couple of things started to kick in that brought the cartridge back down to earth. So first, let's just say that velocity was on the optimistic side. 3,050 to 3,100 feet per second with a 140 grain bullet, more realistic. In fact, Winchester currently makes one factory load today, 140 grain PowerPoint, 30 feet per second. You might be thinking right now, gosh, that's not too dissimilar from a 270 Winchester, 130 grain PowerPoint at 3,060 feet per second. So people started to reasonably ask the question, what is this big Magnum delivering that I can't already get with a 270? Good question. Plus, the 264 Win Mag is also overbore. You really need a 26-inch long barrel to get the best performance out of it. And you take a big hit to velocity with a 22-inch or 24-inch long barrel. This cartridge also has shorter barrel life. You have to be more diligent about cleaning it, too. That Hornady spreadsheet on barrel life I listed earlier lists 750 to 1,400 rounds of average barrel life for the 264 Win Mag. It's not the shortest on the list, but it's pretty darn short. So after some initial success right out the gate, this cartridge took a couple of big hits to its reputation. Then something else happened. The 7mm Remington Magnum in 1963. That cartridge not quite as overbore as a 264 Win Mag. Some rifles were made with a 26-inch long barrel, but it doesn't need it as much as the 264 Win Mag did. It also has a longer barrel life than the 264 as well. 7 Rim Mag is also more versatile. 264 Win Mag perfect for deer and antelope, but it could reach up to elk. The 7 Mag was, I think, more at home on all of those animals. And it will shoot a 150 grain bullet faster than the 264 Win Mag will shoot a 140 grain bullet. So the 264 Win Mag hasn't died, but it's kind of on life support today. Now, other 6.5mm cartridges have come out since then that offer performance on par with, or even better than, the 264 Win Mag. Remington and Winchester both still make ammo for it. 140 grain PowerPoint or core lock at 30 feet per second. Max point blank range, 326 yards with 140 grain core lock. That's not performance to sneer at. Still works today as well as it did back in the 1960s. I knew an older gentleman back in El Paso that hunted with a Model 70 and 264 Win Mag, killed a couple of mule deer with it, worked great for him. Winchester still makes the Model 70 and 264 Win Mag as well. They don't anymore, but Remington once offered it in the Model 700. Same thing with Ruger and Browning. So it's not that it's a bad cartridge or that it doesn't work or that you shouldn't hunt with it, but with all of this stuff, if you're trying to pick this cartridge versus that cartridge, it becomes a question of, well, what does this one do that I can't do as good or better with this other cartridge that has these other advantages in terms of maybe better availability of rifles and ammo, less recoil, things like that. And that's where just the poor old 264 Win Mag falls short these days. But if you have one and you want to hunt with it, especially if you are willing and able to reload, it'll darn sure work for you. Before we move on to the next cartridge, here is a blurb from Rifle Cartridges for the Hunter, written by Richard Mann, talking about the 264 Win Mag. Aside from the cool factor, the 264 has versatility. If you like Hornady bullets, you can easily launch their 95 grain VMAX to 3,500 feet per second and their 160 grain round nose to 2,800 feet per second. The most common hunting bullet weight in the 264 has long been 140 grains. I used a Remington Sendero in 264 with a 140 grain Berger VLD to take a red stag in New Zealand at 289 yards. The bullet hit just under the spine, penetrated the diaphragm, and the bull dropped in his tracks. That same bullet also produced one-shot drops on 4 feral goats at distances I'd rather not admit to shooting at. End of quote. Next up, we have the 6.5mm Remington Magnum. This was the first short-action 6.5mm Magnum round, made by necking down a 350 Remington Magnum. That cartridge was itself a shortened 375 H&H case. The 6.5 Rim Mag had an overall length of 2.8 inches. This cartridge had a lot of potential, but is a great example of how, especially back in the 1900s, Remington seemed like they just could not get out of their way when designing cartridges. Here is a blurb from Any Shot You Want talking about it. Remington countered in 1966 with the 6.5 Remington Magnum, a shorter, belted case that, was lumbered with so many handicaps it is a wonder it ever saw the light of day. First, they gave it powder capacity equal to the 30-06, exactly what the doctor ordered. Then they chambered it in a short-action rifle and set the overall cartridge length so absurdly short you could not use a 140-grain bullet without compromising powder capacity. On top of that, the rifle had such a short barrel, 18 inches, it was impossible to get much velocity out of it anyway. The standard loading was a 129-grain bullet. What they ended up with, in effect, was a 270 in an 18-inch barreled rifle. Given that it should be treated as the equivalent of a 270 in both action and barrel length, the 6.5 Remington would have been a good cartridge. As it was, it died a quick and unlamented death. A cartridge designed by committee, if ever there was one. End of quote. That was Terry Wieland from Any Shot You Want. And as rough as that was, that's not the only example in this episode I'm going to give of Remington taking a cartridge that had a lot of potential and then screwing it up when they designed it and launched it. Now, expounding upon what I just read from Terry, Remington initially released this cartridge in their Model 600 carbine that had an 18.5-inch long barrel. They later released it in the Model 660 carbine that had a 20-inch long barrel. Yet Remington was advertising velocities with a 24-inch long barrel, and so the only rifles available for the cartridge were getting velocities nowhere close to what Remington was telling them that they were achieving. So naturally, neither of those rifles were a success. Remington discontinued them, though they did eventually launch the cartridge in their Model 700 rifle with a 24-inch long barrel. That's what they should have done from the beginning. Now, like Terry mentioned, another big problem with it was these rifles had very short magazines, and the way the cartridge was built, it didn't have a lot of head height. That meant the cartridge did not play well with a 140-grain bullet, which is really the sweet spot for the 6.5 millimeter bore diameter. Performance did improve when the cartridge was offered in a long action, where you could seat the bullet farther out. Same thing with a longer barrel, but that just defeated the entire purpose of the cartridge, though. Now, the 264 Win Mag came out before the 6.5 millimeter Remington. When both are fired from a 24-inch long barrel, the 264 Win Mag will handily beat it. And if you drop down to a shorter barrel, it unreasonably handicapped the 6.5 millimeter Remington. And at that point, it's not doing that much more than something like a 6.5 Swede was doing. And so people began to reasonably ask the question, what the heck is the point of this round? There's no factory rifles or ammo produced in it. Hendershots does make custom ammo for it, though. Among other loads, they make a 140-grain Accubon loading at 2,800 feet per second. That's probably out of a 24-inch long barrel. Other rounds have come along since then that duplicate or even exceed that performance, which is why not many people use a 6.5 millimeter Remington Magnum today. Speaking of cartridges that had a lot of potential that Remington screwed up, now let's move on to the 260 Remington. Now, there are two rounds I often hear guys chirp about when I mention the 6.5 Creedmoor. One is the 6.5 by 55 Swede. The other is the 260 Remington. The 260 is essentially a .308 Winchester neck down to 6.5 millimeter. It has a long history as a wildcat. Remington standardized it with SAAMI in 1997. So what happened with this round? Well, a couple of things. First, the timing just wasn't quite right with it. Remington had no way of knowing this at the time, but there was some bad luck involved in this. This round came out a little before the long-range shooting boom that kicked off in the mid-2000s. Remington initially optimized the 260 for lighter 120-grain bullets. With this in mind, SAAMI spec twist rate for the 260 is 1 in 9 inches. The 260 shoots those lighter bullets fine, but it didn't work as well with heavier bullets. At least the initial offerings from Remington did not. So Remington initially rolled out this cartridge, paired with rifles with a 1 in 9 inch twist rate, shooting 120 grain bullets, marketed it for deer hunters, marketed it as a low recoil option, things like that. But that left people scratching their heads, thinking, well, what's this new 260 supposed to do that I couldn't already accomplish with a 243 or a 708? Poor quality control on some of those initial rifle offerings didn't help. Neither did the shorter barrels some of those rifles shipped with, which choked velocity down. Remington eventually got with the program, but the damage had been done. Gosh, sort of like a similar story with the 6mm Remington. Man, I could do a whole podcast on nothing but cartridges that had a lot of potential that Remington screwed up one way or another. 6mm Remington, 260 Remington, 280 Remington, the 6.5mm Remington Magnum, etc. Now, funny enough, the 260 Remington has slightly greater case capacity than the 6.5 Creedmoor. Both are similar sized cartridges. Both are short action rounds. So that bigger case for the 260 results in less head height. Furthermore, the 6.5 Creedmoor is loaded to a little bit higher pressure, 62,000 psi versus 60,000 for the 260 Remington. So the end result, kind of like what I was talking about with the 6.5 Swede earlier, where it had that lower pressure but much greater case capacity, same sort of thing with the 260 versus the 6.5 Creedmoor, just the gap is a little bit closer on both of those. But the end result is performance is very, very similar for these two cartridges with the same bullets. The 260 can push the same weight bullet a little faster than the 6.5 Creedmoor when it is hand-loaded hot, though. But because it has a little bit less head height than the 6.5 Creedmoor, it doesn't play quite as well with really long aerodynamic bullets. That doesn't mean they won't work with the 260 Remington, though. It's just a little bit more challenging. Now, there was a lady named Sergeant Sherry Gallagher. She was in the Army Marksmanship Unit. She won an NRA high-powered rifle championship at Camp Perry using a 260 Remington. I think this was 2010, 2011, something like that. But people will often use her using the 260 as an example of what that cartridge is capable of. Now, that is true. She won that championship. She did great. She used a 260 Remington, but she wasn't using an off-the-shelf Model 7 or 700 rifle. No, that was a highly customized rifle with special handloads. It had a fast twist rate, and it had a custom chamber optimized for use with heavy, long, high BC bullets. She used a 142-grain Sierra bullet for that match. But in other words, she turned her 260 Remington into something more resembling a 6.5 Creedmoor than an old off-the-shelf 260 Remington. Now, there's nothing wrong with the 260 Remington for what most people use it for. Ammo and rifles are harder to find these days because it is slowly dying off, but it is still there. And all of that stuff will work just fine. And like I said, they did eventually get with the program. For instance, I know Tikka makes rifles in 260 Remington, and they make them with a 1-in-8 twist. So you can use, more modern 6.5mm bullets. That was not the case with the original design of it. You don't have nearly as broad of a spectrum of factory rifle or ammunition options as the 6.5 Creedmoor. And there's some other minor differences and stuff for it, but, for shooting a deer 200 yards, something like that, and even, stretching it out a little bit under the right conditions and all of that stuff, the 260 Remington, not different at all in practical terms from the 6.5 Creedmoor. You have a 260, it's all set up the way you like it, it works for you, great, by all means hunt with it. But don't be mad at Hornady for making the 6.5 Creedmoor correctly from the start, or at other people for liking the fruits of Hornady's work. If you got to be mad at anybody, be mad at Remington for screwing up a cartridge that had great potential and then leaving the door open for someone else to step in and serve the market they failed. Now, speaking of cartridge flops, we're going to talk about a cartridge that flopped but ended up being the genesis for another round that actually did really well, and that is the 6.5 284 Norma. The 284 Winchester was a tremendous flop when Winchester introduced it in 1963. However, that cartridge, with its short, fat design, has turned into a pretty darn successful platform for wildcat cartridges. The 6.5 284 Norma is one such round. Now, that short, fat design results in plenty of powder capacity while also having a lot of head height, which, like I mentioned earlier, facilitates the use of long, high BC bullets. Now, the 284 Winchester was only 2.8 inches long overall, right? True short action cartridge. But the Swedish company Norma standardized a round neck down to 6.5 millimeter with a much longer 3.228 inch overall length in 1999. They called it the 6.5 284 Norma. Now, this cartridge is not quite 30-06 length. It's a little bit shorter, and If you look at a photo of it, you will see that it has a lot of bullet sticking out of the case, so a lot of head height. This cartridge has a .501-inch case head diameter, .473-inch rebated rim, 2.17-inch case length. CIP standardized it first, then it was eventually adapted to SAAMI, 1 and 8.98-inch SAAMI spec twist rate. That's because it was a CIP standardization adapted over. 58,000 PSI max average pressure with SAAMI. CIP is different, but similar relative to other cartridges that are standardized with both. So it's a high-ish pressure round, but not, right up at the top. Now, there have been different variations of 6.5 millimeter wildcats based on the 284 Winchester over the years. Each has slight differences in design. This did complicate things a little bit when Norma eventually standardized it. This is a sort of story you hear over and over again with wildcats that have been out in the wild for a long time before someone tries to standardize them with CIP and or SAAMI. The longer something is a wildcat, the harder it is to standardize. This is because those slight variations in chamber and cartridge design can result in a 6.5 284 rifle with one design not functioning with ammo that's made to slightly different specs. Thus, the company trying to standardize the cartridge might have to make compromises in their design so that all of that stuff will function safely in as many rifles as possible and with as many different types of ammo as possible. But Norma did a good job with this design, and the 6.5 284 turned into a reasonably successful round among hunters and especially long-range target shooters. People often built it with custom 26 to 30-inch long rifle barrels to really squeeze velocity out of it. And some of these setups have been known to produce just incredible, amazing accuracy. The 6.5 284 did reasonably well, was reasonably popular in the hunting space for a while. I know Gunworks, among other companies, made 6.5 284 Norma rifles for a little while, and it kind of filled that 6.5 millimeter Magnum niche for guys that wanted to hunt with something like that. But it has gradually waned in popularity in more recent years as other cartridges have eclipsed it. Still works fine if you have one. There's no reason to get rid of it or any of that stuff. There are still factory ammo options out there for it, still factory rifle options too. Just as an example of a couple factory loads, Norma makes one 143 grain bond strike at 2887 feet per second. Nosler makes a load with 140 grain AccuBond at 2750 feet per second. So that's quite a bit of difference in performance. 328 yard max point blank range for that bond strike load. And of course, you can hand load for this cartridge as well. I know Christensen Arms currently makes rifles in this chambering. Same thing with Savage. Other companies have made it as well in the past. But like I said, it is starting to fall by the wayside and get replaced by newer rounds, especially the 6.5 PRC that will outperform the 6.5 284, and it didn't have to make that sometimes awkward wildcat to standard cartridge transition. Now, before we talk about the 6.5 PRC, let's talk about the 6.5 Grendel. That was kind of the next one up in this timeline of 6.5 millimeter cartridges we're talking about. The 6.5 Grendel was the result of efforts to improve upon the long-range performance of the 223/556 cartridge, yet still function in an AR-15. Bill Alexander of Alexander Arms was the lead on this project. He essentially modified a 6.5 PPC cartridge. It self-descended from the Soviet 7.62x39 and used that as the basis for the Grendel. And this round takes its name from the monster in the epic poem Beowulf. And by the way, Bill Alexander also designed a round known as the 50 Beowulf, which is a 50 cal cartridge designed for the AR-15. So these cartridges do have awesome names, but don't worry, their performance is also awesome too. Remember what I was saying earlier about issues with too many wildcat variations for a round and how that can complicate SAAMI standardization? Well, Alexander took the somewhat unusual step of trademarking the name 6.5 Grendel when he built this round, and that had the effect of eliminating this problem. People were welcome to build similar cartridges, but they just couldn't call them a 6.5 Grendel. And since Alexander Arms built rifles, he was able to control the specs of all the rifles bearing the name 6.5 Grendel after the initial release of the round in 2003. He later collaborated with Hornady to get SAAMI standardization for the round in 2010, at which point he released the trademark. Now, since the 6.5 Grendel is designed to function in an AR-15, max overall length of the 6.5 Grendel is 2.26 inches, 50,000 psi max pressure, 1 in 8 twist rate, 0.437-inch case head diameter. Same overall length as a 5.56, but it uses a slightly fatter case and, of course, a larger diameter bullet. The 6.5 Grendel either matches or exceeds the performance of several older rounds I talk about in this episode, and it does so out of a much more compact package. This is an awesome, awesome rifle cartridge. I personally think the 6.5 Grendel is the best overall package for someone wanting a high-performance round that still functions in an AR-15, and that is especially true when rifle and ammo selection are both taken into account. Now, there are lots of factory ammo options out there, but I personally believe Hornady's load with 123 grain SST at 2580 feet per second is the best overall performing hunting load for this round. Max point blank range of 289 yards with that ammo. This cartridge is great for deer, coyotes, hogs. That's what I think it's awesome for. Some people have been known to stretch it up a little bit. We can talk about that here in a second. I think that Hornady load is great. Barnes also makes an excellent 115 grain TAC TX load for the 6.5 Grendel as well. The 6.5 Grendel is available in a plethora of different AR-15 options. Also some bolt-action rifles too. Ruger American Ranch is a perfect example. Now, I mentioned earlier about hunting bigger game with the 6.5 Grendel. It'll certainly work, but I think it is kind of pushing things. There's a video that makes the rounds of the internet sometimes of a teenage girl shooting, looked like a pretty decent elk at about 400 yards with the 6.5 Grendel. And she killed it, but that video I don't think is a ringing endorsement of the performance of that cartridge on game that size at long range. The video has been edited, and so I'm not exactly sure how much time elapsed between her first shot and the last shot, but it looked like it took a pretty decent amount of time, longer than I like to see for that animal to die. So yes, it will work, but like I said, I think that's just pushing it a little bit, especially at that range. But deer, hogs, and the like, I think that is just a perfect setup for that cartridge. Okay, next, we have a cartridge that some people love to love and other people love to hate. The 6.5 Creedmoor is known derisively as the 6.5 Needmore or the 6.5 Man Bun to certain people, but other people call it America's cartridge or the 30-06 of the 20th century or the 6.5 Bleedmore. Say what you will about it, but this round finally made 6.5 millimeter cool in the USA. It was introduced by Hornady in 2007, and it was built specifically as a better alternative to the .308 Winchester for long-range target shooting. The 6.5 Creedmoor is flatter shooting, it performs better in the wind, it has less recoil, and it has better accuracy overall. The folks at Hornady built it using a modified 30 Thompson Center case. 30 Thompson Center was a complete failure on its own merits when it came out, but it ended up serving as a good platform for the 6.5 Creedmoor when they built it. The end result is the 6.5 Creedmoor is similar to the 260 Remington, but is not exactly the same. The Creedmoor has a slightly longer overall length, a slightly shorter case, and both of those translate into more head height for the bullet. That's the amount of space that's available for the bullet to be outside the case while still staying within the max overall length specified by SAAMI. It also has a steeper 30-degree shoulder and a slightly less tapered case. It also has a faster 1 in 8-inch twist rate and is also loaded to a slightly higher 62,000 psi SAAMI max average pressure. So performance is very, very similar to the 260 Remington at first glance. But right off the bat, the 6.5 Creedmoor does play a little bit better with long, heavy, high BC bullets than the 260 Remington. Typical ballistics, 140 grain bullet at 2,700 feet per second for the Creedmoor. You can get loads with lighter varmint bullets, say like a 95 grain VMAX. You can also use 120 to 130 grain copper bullets, and you can also use stuff that's a little bit heavier, like a 147 grain ELD match or 156 grain Oryx. Max point blank range, 143 grain ELDX at 2,700 feet per second is 307 yards. Everybody makes 6.5 Creedmoor rifles and ammo too. Now, unlike the 260 Remington, the 6.5 Creedmoor just came along at the right time as things were changing in the long-distance shooting world and has ridden that wave over the past 2 decades. Like I mentioned, it's designed to use long, heavy, high BC bullets that are efficient. The cartridge doesn't push them that fast, but it is very efficient, and those bullets buck the wind well, and they hang on to velocity much better than lower BC bullets. Plus, even people who don't like the Creedmoor will often concede that it is unusually accurate. This is because the guys at Hornady incorporated some best practices that bench rest shooters have known about for years when they were building this round. There are certain cartridges that just seem to be unusually accurate. The 6mm PPC is a great example. And the folks at Hornady took a look at cartridges like the 6mm PPC and incorporated some of the same traits that those cartridges had into the Creedmoor when they were building it. That steeper 30-degree shoulder is a great example. A case with minimal taper is another example. The way they design the chamber of the cartridge is another. Things like that. Now, John Snow and I talk about all of these modern cartridge design principles in more detail in episode 366 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. Listen to that discussion for more details about all of that stuff. But putting aside exactly how they went about doing it, the folks at Hornady built a cartridge that is just darn accurate with most rifles and most ammunition, right? Every now and then you're going to get a dog in there that just won't shoot. But on average, with factory rifles, factory ammo, this is an incredibly accurate cartridge. This was really the first cartridge a person could achieve decent accuracy at 1,000 yards with using an off-the-shelf rifle and factory ammo for less than $1,000. Like the classic 6.5 Creedmoor starter pack is a Ruger American Predator with a Vortex Crossfire scope and Hornady Precision Hunter ammo. Put all of that stuff together, and you could be ringing steel at 1,000 yards that afternoon. The term game changer gets thrown around a lot, but I think the 6.5 Creedmoor really was a game changer in this area. When I was a kid, shooting 1,000 yards was something you needed to spend a ton of money on with a custom setup and just really know what the heck you were doing in order to do. Now it is much more easily accessible. I'm not exaggerating that much when I say shooting 1,000 yards with the right setup today is like shooting 400 yards 30 years ago. I have personally shot out past a mile with a 6.5 Creedmoor. Now, this isn't one of those deals where I had to shoot 17 times to hit the target or any baloney like that. I got down on the gun, got my dope set up on it, estimated a wind hold, missed with my first shot, corrected with my second shot, nailed the target on the second, missed with the third, hit it with the fourth. So I shot a total of 4 shots at a mile with a 6.5 Creedmoor, and I hit it with 2. There's no way I'd shoot an animal that far away, of course, but that is still darn impressive performance for that little round. And that was with an off-the-shelf Bergara rifle and factory Norma ammo. No, that's not something you could easily do with the 260 Remington when it first came on the scene in the 1990s. Now, the 6.5 Creedmoor was something of a slow burn at first. It did well in competitive shooting circles, but it was not an instant hit with the general hunting and shooting communities. That started to change in 2014, 2015, thereabouts. I think I first heard of the 6.5 Creedmoor myself in 2016. And of course, this was back when I was still in the Army and not doing this job full time. And I noticed it really start to take off in about 2017. Now, my first, oh wow, what the heck is this moment with the cartridge came when I saw a video of the gun writer Wayne Van Zwal shooting an elk at over 600 yards with a 6.5 Creedmoor. I saw that video, I think, in about 2017. That really caught my attention. So yes, no matter what people say, the 6.5 Creedmoor is technically a 600-yard elk cartridge. Now, that doesn't mean you or I should be shooting elk that far with it. or anything at that far with it other than paper or steel. But yes, it is capable out that far in the right hands under the right circumstances. I'm also not saying it is the quote-unquote best elk hunting cartridge or that it would be something that I would even recommend that most people would use. It'll work. I think it's better than something like a 6.5 Grendel on elk, especially at a range like 400 yards, but I don't think it is ideal. A friend of mine named Mark Floyd came on the podcast several years ago, episode 172. He talked about some experience, or rather an experience he had shooting an elk with the 6.5 Creedmoor. I think that hunt was maybe 2019 where he killed that elk. And then he killed another elk a couple years later with a 300 Win Mag. And so that episode was a discussion talking about those two hunts and the pros and cons of using each cartridge on elk. So have a listen at that episode for more details about this discussion. Now, furthermore, I've had a guy named Tyler Friel on the show to talk about a grizzly bear he killed with a 6.5 Creedmoor in Alaska, episode 282. He used 140 grain Nosler partition, shot this bear over bait, and the results were impressive. He got the whole thing on video, too. Now, I bring up these two examples not to say that you need to be hunting grizzly bear or elk with the 6.5 Creedmoor. I bring it up just to say that because it works on those bigger animals like that, there's no reason at all you should hesitate to use this cartridge on smaller game. For instance, I went on a pronghorn hunt in Colorado, I think 2022, and I was with a guide, and as often goes on a guided hunt like that, it was, met my guide, in the morning, and I was, chatting with him before the sun came up, and we're feeling each other out and stuff. And he asked me what rifle I brought with me, and I told him what it was and that it was chambered in 6.5 Creedmoor. I just kind of slid it out there to see what he would say. And his reaction was very strong, but not how I was expecting him to respond. He said, "Oh, man, I love the 6.5 Creedmoor. I think that is the best pronghorn cartridge ever." Oh, okay. I wasn't expecting that. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this here later, but the cartridge worked beautifully on this hunt. Could not have asked for better performance. Now, I think the 6.5 Creedmoor is a wonderful round, but it is certainly lacking in some areas, namely speed. Now, I also need to address an elephant in the room. Someone's probably saying to themselves right now, "John, you're talking about killing grizzly bear and elk and stuff with the 6.5 Creedmoor. That doesn't match my experiences with it. My buddy shot a deer last year, or I shot a deer last year, or whatever, with the 6.5 Creedmoor, and it ran off and we never found it. Or, it ran off and went 100 yards and didn't leave a single drop of blood on the ground, and we had to get a dog to go out there and find it. It was an absolute disaster." Those are valid points, and it is absolutely true that people do get into trouble with the 6.5 Creedmoor. I think that is a problem with bullet selection on one hand, and I think overconfidence on the other hand. Now, I will address the overconfidence first. The 6.5 Creedmoor does attract a lot of newer hunters and shooters. There is nothing inherently wrong with that, but first off, yes, those people can be annoying. I'm not saying you're annoying if you hunt with a 6.5 Creedmoor. You might be, but I'm not saying it's guaranteed. That just seems to be something, though, that happens with some people that are using a newer cartridge like that. It's not limited to the Creedmoor. People felt the same way about the 270 Winchester in the 1930s, in those years after Winchester released it. All the 30-06 guys kind of looked at the 270 guys, kind of like how some people look at the 6.5 Creedmoor guys today. So deserved or not, it happens. Furthermore, those people are sometimes prone to make poor decisions because they are simply inexperienced. I had a chat with my son about this the other day. He's 9 years old. He killed an impala this past summer in Africa. That was his first big game animal. He's very proud of that accomplishment. He wants to continue to hunt. And he was asking me actually this morning when I will let him hunt alone. Now, he's not ready to do that for a variety of reasons. First and foremost is safety. But beyond that, he does not have the experience yet to know when to pass on a shot, both for legal and practical reasons. The animal's too far away, or it's not giving him a good angle, or there's some obstructions in the way, or there's an animal behind the one he's trying to shoot. All of those things that we learn from our mentors and just sometimes learn the hard way as we gain experience hunting, he doesn't know right now because he's so new. I will teach him some of those things, and he'll undoubtedly make some mistakes like I did and learn some of those other lessons the hard way as well. The same is also true with a lot of newer hunters who started off with the Creedmoor, and the poor decisions that many people make when they're first getting started that are a normal part of the hunting process sometimes get blamed on the cartridge. There are shots you should not ever take, not with the 6.5 Creedmoor, not with a 30-06, not with the 3.75. Poor results in a situation like that aren't the cartridge's fault, they are the hunter's fault. So that is part of it. There are also situations where the Creedmoor honestly does fail to perform. I think many of those circumstances are the fault of the bullet, the ELDX in particular. That is the most popular single bullet for the round, bar none. It is great for what it is designed to do, which is perform at extended range, low velocity impacts. That pronghorn hunt I was telling you about earlier, I shot that pronghorn between 175 and 200 yards. So it wasn't like close, but it wasn't super duper far either. But that was a great range where that cartridge or that bullet had slowed down to the point where it was right in its optimum impact velocity window, and it hammered that pronghorn. He was facing to the left, broadside, when I shot him. He spun around and started running to the right afterwards, and there was a giant red spot on his offside shoulder. That bullet went in, wrecked his vitals, exited the offside, and he ran less than 30 yards and tipped over. Could not ask for better performance. Excellent, excellent, excellent. That was a situation tailor-made for that bullet, though. Really from about 150 yards out to 450, 500 yards is the optimum impact velocity window for that bullet out of the 6.5 Creedmoor. You go too far, slows down too much, you're not going to get a lot of expansion out of it. If it's too close, that bullet is going to be going too fast, you're going to get lots of expansion and subpar penetration. I'm not saying that bullet is going to blow up or anything like that, but you're probably not going to get an exit wound with it. And that is the sort of situation that explains a lot of the problems people have with it. They shoot a deer at 75 yards with an ELDX bullet, and if it doesn't drop right there at the shot, runs off into the thick timber, it may only go 100 yards after the shot, maybe not even that far. But if you don't get an exit wound, you're not going to get a great blood trail, and it's going to be hard to find, especially in thick cover. You shoot that same deer with a Federal Fusion, or even a Remington Corelock, or a Barnes, or a North Fork Semi-Spitzer, or a Nosler Partition, or something like that, you're going to get much better penetration, and your blood trail will be much easier to follow. I would take any of those bullets, and some others I didn't mention, over an ELDX out of a 6.5 Creedmoor if you know your shot is going to be within 200 yards. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I hear a lot of people say, right, the 6.5 Creedmoor won't do anything my 260 Remington or my 6.5 Swede won't do. I'd say that is partially true. Shooting a deer inside 200 yards, no practical difference between those cartridges. And let's be clear, that's what most people are doing anyway, regardless of what they're using to hunt. So yeah, there's no advantage to having a 6.5 Creedmoor over a 260 Remington in a situation like that, just in terms of shooting the deer and killing it. But while I rate that claim as mostly true, it's not entirely true, and there are some areas where the 6.5 Creedmoor is just better than those other two. First, like I mentioned earlier, amateur study tactics, professional study logistics. The 6.5 Creedmoor has a gigantic advantage over the others in terms of availability of factory ammo and rifles. I looked at Midway USA this morning. They have 88 different factory loads in stock for the 6.5 Creedmoor. 15 for the 260 Remington, 19 for the 6.5 Swede. There are more than twice as many 6.5 Creedmoor ammo options on Midway right now in stock than there are 260 and 6.5 Swede ammo options combined. In terms of just the sheer number of different loads in stock right now on Midway, the 308 is number 1, 223 is number 2, 30-06 number 3. And that's all in stock. 6.5 Creedmoor is next, right behind the 30-06. It's right there with it. 300 Win Mag is a little behind the 6.5 Creedmoor. Then there is a big drop off to the next most common stuff. My local gun shops always have 6.5 Creedmoor ammo in stock. Same thing with rifles. I have literally never seen 260 Remington or 6.5 Swede ammo at any of them. Likely have a little better selection at a big box store, but even though there will be some, probably 260 and 6.5 Swede ammo and rifles there, you're still going to have more options for the 6.5 Creedmoor. So no, it's not a fad. It's not going away anytime soon either. So a giant advantage the 6.5 Creedmoor has is the abundance of factory rifles and ammo. You got cheap stuff, you got premium stuff, you got everything in between. Now, I'm saying this specifically right now about the 6.5 Swede and the 6.5 Creedmoor and the 260 Remington, but what I'm about to say applies across the board to all cartridges of similar performance. There's nothing magical about a head stamp. A given bullet at a given velocity will behave the same way on an animal regardless of whether it's fired from a 6.5 Swede, a 6.5 Creedmoor, or a 260 Remington. There are some differences around the edges in terms of rifle and ammo availability. Same thing with differences in accuracy on average for one versus the others. But those are differences across the aggregate. Yeah, the 6.5 Creedmoor, due to its modern cartridge design principles, is going to be more accurate on average than the other two. That doesn't mean your 260 Remington can't be accurate, or your 6.5 Swede can't be accurate, or that you're not going to have an occasional limit of a 6.5 Creedmoor out there that just won't shoot that well. On average, with factory rifles, factory ammo, it will be a little bit more accurate. But that said, if you have a rifle in any cartridge that you like, that you shoot accurately, and you can get ammo for, be that factory ammo or hand loads, then great. By all means, hunt with it. Have a good time. Don't worry about what anybody else says or hunts with. If you want to use something different from the rest of the crowd, great. Use a 6.5 Swede or a 260 Remington or something else I've talked about in this episode. If you want to use the 6.5 Creedmoor because it's the easy button, great. You do you. Best of luck afield to you. All right, let's move on to a completely different cartridge, the 26 Nosler. This was the first Nosler proprietary cartridge, and it bridges the gap between the old and new way of doing things. This is a high-velocity cartridge that also uses a high BC bullet. It'll shoot 142 grain Accubon long range that at 400 yards is going about as fast as that same bullet from the 6.5 Creedmoor is at the muzzle. Nosler released the 26 Nosler in 2013. It's basically a 404 Jeffrey case, neck down, has a rebated rim, shortened to fit 30-06 length action. 3.34 inch overall length, 2.59 inch case length, 0.55 inch case head diameter. So this is a shorter and pretty darn fat cartridge, really big powder capacity. Now this cartridge kind of came out in conjunction with the new Accubon long range bullet from Nosler. That bullet was right on the leading edge of a new trend with higher BC projectiles. It was actually one of the first, if not the first, purpose-built hunting bullet designed for use at extended range. And it came out before the Hornady ELDX. Nosler makes 6 loads for it, 5 of them specifically for hunting. I'm not going to go into the details of all of them, but one of them, 129 grain Accubon long range at 3,400 feet per second, 142 grain Accubon long range at 3,300 feet per second, 150 grain Accubon long range at 3,200 feet per second. So you have a spectrum of choices here ranging from a very heavy, high BC bullet going fast to a lighter, still decently high BC bullet going really fast. That 150 grain loading has just 30 inches of drop at 500 yards with a 200 yard zero, 11.6 inches of wind deflection, 10 mile an hour, full value crosswind. That is insane. Max point blank range, 376 yards with that 129 grain loading. This cartridge with the right bullets is on par with the best 7 PRC ammo in terms of performance in the wind, but shoots even flatter. 142 grain bullet out of the 26 Nosler will be 600 feet per second faster than the 6.5 Creedmoor, same weight bullet, 350 feet per second faster than the 6.5 PRC with that same bullet. Now, Nosler is the only big company I know of that makes 26 Nosler ammo. You can, of course, hand load for it and use Nosler component bullets and component bullets from other companies. Nosler builds rifles in that chambering. Same thing with Christensen Arms. You used to be able to get Browning X-bolts in 26 Nosler as well. I don't think you can anymore. 24 to 26-inch barrels are common with it. Really kind of need that 26-inch barrel, though, to get the most out of this cartridge. Now, on the downside, 26 Nosler is a barrel burner, even more so than the 28 Nosler. And this round is starting to fall by the wayside. Ammo is expensive. It's hard to get. you just don't have a lot of rifle options either. Nosler makes fantastic rifles, but they are pricey. Now, this cartridge is an interesting mix of stuff. Very flat shooting, wonderful performance at extended range because it has enough velocity, but it also works well with high BC bullets, like that 150 grain Accubon long range. But it's also overbore. It's also the opposite of efficient, too. But if you want something that is great for an open country hunt, you want the best possible way to deal with wind, trajectory, all that stuff, well, this is a great cartridge for that. Another great cartridge for that sort of work is the 6.5 300 Weatherby. That is a 300 Weatherby neck down to 6.5 millimeter. 3.6 inch overall length, 2.825 inch case length, belted case, 0.5117 inch case head diameter, longer and skinnier than that 26 Nosler. Just the case on this cartridge is about as long as the entire 6.5 Creedmoor cartridge. Roy Weatherby is said to have toyed around with this round in the 1940s. Weatherby didn't officially launch it until much more recently. I think 2016. Still pretty darn new. Believe it or not, that's also the first 6.5 millimeter round from Weatherby. But it is fast. Weatherby offers a couple factory loads for it. 140 grain interlock at $32.75. 127 grain Barnes LRX at $34.75. 156 grain Berger at $30.50. 130 grain Swift at $34.25, 129 grain Hammer at $34.50. It shoots a 156 grain bullet faster than a 6.5 PRC shoots a 143 grain bullet. Max point blank range, 382 yards. That's with the Swift Sirocco load I just mentioned. So it shoots a little bit flatter than the already flat shooting 26 Nosler. Now this is a long cartridge. You need a full-length Magnum action to use it. You can only use Weatherby rifles and ammo with it, as far as I know. But it is, as far as I know, the fastest 6.5 millimeter mass-produced cartridge in production. But like the 26 Nosler, you need a long barrel, 26-inch long barrel for optimum performance. Now, continuing along with the downsides of it, you have more recoil, you have more muzzle blast with it, you have a short barrel life, and expensive ammo, all of that stuff. This round actually has the dubious distinction of the shortest average barrel life of everything listed on the Hornady barrel life spreadsheet. 514 to 841 rounds of barrel life on average. Yeah, sub 1,000 round barrel life ain't great. If you're just hunting with this rifle and all of that, that's still plenty, but you're getting down into the area where it could start to become a problem with something that is excessively overbore like this cartridge. But it's darn cool, though. You want speed? We got it. Everything you could say about the 26 Nosler, you could also say about the 6.5 300 Weatherby, just more in every way, good and bad. Next up, we have the 6.5 Precision Rifle cartridge. This is another 6.5 millimeter round from Hornady. Came on the scene 2017, 2018. This was the first of 3 precision rifle cartridges from them. We've since seen the 300 and 7mm PRC. This is a short, fat cartridge made from a shortened, neck-down 300 Ruger Compact Magnum that is itself a modified 375 Ruger. It uses a beltless case that has a fatter case head diameter than cases based off the old 375 H&H. For instance, non-belted portion of the 264 Win Mag case is 0.512 inches versus 0.532 inches for the case head diameter of the 6.5 PRC. So that results in a lot of case capacity with a pretty short overall length for the 6.5 PRC, 2.955 inches overall length. It's basically as long as a cartridge can be and still fit in an AICS short-action rifle magazine. 65,000 PSI, SAAMI max pressure, 1 1/8-inch twist rate. You get quite a bit more case capacity with the 6.5 PRC compared to something like a 6.5 Creedmoor 2. That cartridge has a 0.470-inch case head diameter. 6.5 PRC will shoot 143 grain ELDX at 2960 feet per second. That's the same bullet, 260 feet per second faster than the 6.5 Creedmoor. Now, it is not directly related to the 6.5 Creedmoor, but you could think of the 6.5 PRC as a 6.5 Creedmoor on steroids, or a Magnum 6.5 Creedmoor. Max point blank range, 336 yards for that 143 grain ELDX load. As I mentioned earlier, You have very similar performance with the 6.5 PRC to the 6.5 284 Norma. It's actually a little faster. Plus, it also fits in a short-action rifle. It also avoids all those wildcat adoption problems, too. And, like the 6.5 Creedmoor, it incorporates all of those modern cartridge design principles, so it has excellent accuracy potential. Now, this cartridge was designed from the ground up as a great PRS round. It's a fast round that comes in right under the maximum velocity that is allowed in PRS competitions. It also performs well in the wind, mild recoil. This has become a fantastic, very popular hunting cartridge as well. It's flat shooting, great in the wind, hammers game at ranges farther than most people have any business shooting. It's a very shootable package as well. Lots of outfitters out west love it because it works so darn well, and most clients can handle the recoil and shoot it accurately. Now, I just returned from an elk hunt. This was the single most popular round in camp on that hunt. I think 6 out of 15 guys were using it. This might be the perfect all-around 6.5 millimeter hunting cartridge today. And you get basically all of the things people love about the 6.5 Creedmoor with a little bit of extra juice. It comes at the expense of a slightly shorter barrel life and a little bit more recoil. But all in all, depending on what you want to do with it, I think the juice is worth the squeeze with the 6.5 PRC. Oh, and I forgot to mention, you have lots of rifle and ammo choices for it too. And because it is a short-action cartridge, you can get a darn lightweight, very easy to carry rifle in this chambering as well. And even with a lighter weight rifle, recoil is still mild to moderate. Now, Rob Massa told the story of a hunter in episode 397 who was booked on an elk hunt with him. It was an archery elk hunt. The guy hunted hard all through archery season, had a lot of close encounters with elk, but just could not quite close the deal. You know, cows kept blowing out the bull and stuff like that. Had a lot of fun, did not kill an elk. In Wyoming, if you draw that elk tag, it is good in the archery and rifle seasons. You just have to buy the archery endorsement. So that guy came back a few weeks later during the rifle season. He ended up taking a great bull elk with a 6.5 PRC at just under 600 yards. Now, he had attended a shooting school there previously. He spent time at the range, all that stuff, so he knew how to shoot. He wasn't a guy that, you just handed him a rifle and sent him out to the woods or anything. So he could shoot well. But long story short, he had a short rifle hunt, got on a group of elk, took a quartering away shot at the nice bull in the herd, tucked it in behind the shoulder, 153 grain Berger hybrid target, just dumped it right there. Tough to argue with performance like that. Okay, the last cartridge we'll talk about in this episode is the 6.5 Weatherby RPM, or Rebated Precision Magnum cartridge. Introduced in 2020, this was the first Weatherby round that did not have an H&H belt on it. It was also the first with a traditional angled shoulder instead of the signature Weatherby double radius shoulder. It uses a case based on a lengthened .284 Winchester. Has a rebated rim, just like the name says. Same length and rim diameter as the 30-06, but it is slightly fatter, 0.5000-inch case head diameter for the 6.5 Weatherby RPM. 65,000 PSI SAAMI max average pressure, 1 1/8-inch twist rate. The 6.5 Weatherby RPM is more powerful than a 6.5 284, has ballistics almost identical to the 6.5 PRC. The Weatherby case has a longer and trimmer shape than the 6.5 PRC, and it has a longer overall length than the 6.5 284. So the idea with this Weatherby round was for more reliable feeding and greater magazine capacity in a more svelte rifle. Weatherby offers this cartridge in a couple of different rifles, but they initially designed it for their 6-lug Mark V action. This is their more trim, more lightweight rifle. For instance, the Backcountry 2.0 TI offering in 6.5 Weatherby RPM comes in at 4.9 pounds slick with a 4+1 magazine capacity. So you're getting essentially 6.5 PRC level performance in a very lightweight and compact rifle with a magazine capacity of a 308, a 6.5 Creedmoor, etc. type cartridge. The 6.5 Weatherby is a very niche offering, but it is nice to have if that's what you want. Now, like I said earlier, the 6.5 PRC delivers ballistic performance right in what I think is that perfect sweet spot, where it's just enough in all the right areas without being too much in any of the wrong areas. Well, that's what you get with the 6.5 Weatherby RPM, just with that compatibility in a very trim, lightweight rifle. Now, the downside of the Weatherby cartridge is that it is, as far as I know, only available from Weatherby, both rifles and ammunition. Ammo and rifle choices are limited. They are also expensive. Weatherby currently produces a couple of factory loads for it, 124 grain hammer at 3250 feet per second, 127 grain LRX at 3225, 130 grain Swift Sirocco at 3150, 140 grain Interlock at 2975, 156 grain Berger Elite Hunter at 2940. That loading with the 124 grain hammer is the flattest shooting of the bunch. Max point blank range of 357 yards with that bullet. Now, this is a very niche offering, but I also don't think Weatherby built it for widespread appeal. I think Weatherby built it for people that like Weatherby guns and ammo, and they want a rifle and a cartridge that delivers that. So it is great for what it is designed for. So we talked about a pretty broad range of 6.5 millimeter cartridges in this episode. 3 were designed by Hornady. All 3 very successful, 6.5 Grendel, Creedmoor, and PRC. 2 from Remington. 1 was moderately successful. 1 was a complete flop. And we have the 260 Remington and the 6.5 millimeter Remington Magnum. 2 from Weatherby, 6.5 Weatherby RPM, 6.5 300 Weatherby. 1 from Nosler with the 26 Nosler. 1 from Winchester with the 264 Winchester Magnum. 1 from A Square with the 6.5-06. And we also have several old European cartridges, several of which were used by various militaries over there. The 6.5 by 52, by 54, by 55, and by 57. The 57 was not used by any military, though its namesake was. The 6.5 by 50 millimeter Japanese, not a European cartridge, but used by the Japanese military, and there was a lot of British influence in Japan, especially with their military at the time. We also have the 6.5 284 Norma. That was never a military cartridge, but it is a European commercial cartridge. Now, of rounds still in common use in the USA, 6.5 Grendel, Creedmoor, PRC, all at the top of the heap in terms of popularity. Next tier, right below that, we have the 6.5 by 55, the 260 Remington, the 6.5 284, 6.5 RPM, 6.5 300 Weatherby, 26 Nosler. Those are all niche offerings, but they all seem to have loyal followings. You could include the 264 Win Mag in here too, though it seems like that is really starting to fade. The 6.5 by 50 Japanese, 6.5 by 52 Carcano, 6.5 by 54 Mannlicher, 6.5 by 57, all in an even lower tier in terms of widespread use. And below even them, we have the 6.5-06 and the 6.5 millimeter Remington, which are practically dead in just very, very isolated use cases for both of those. We talked about a lot of stuff in this episode. Some was lighthearted, like my grandfather shooting that deer while he was answering nature's call. And then, of course, a lot of conventional hunting and shooting type stories involving hunting deer, antelope, elk, moose, lion, and even elephant. And then on the more sober side of things, we talked about a couple of these rounds being used by various military forces during wartime to kill and injure soldiers in opposing militaries. And also how one of these rounds was unfortunately used in an assassination of a president of the United States. These cartridges are just inanimate objects, though. But regardless of the intentions of those using them, each of these cartridges seems to perform within a couple of relatively narrow performance bands. The lower-powered cartridges will shoot 120 to 140 grain bullet at 2,200 to 2,500 feet per second. That mostly encompasses some of those older cartridges, but it does include the Grendel, which has an artificially low ceiling on its performance just because it has to function in an AR-15. Then we have higher-powered stuff, throwing a 140 grain bullet at 2,600 to 2,950 feet per second. 6.5 Creedmoor, 6.5 Swede, 260 Remington, 6.5 284, 6.5 PRC, 6.5-06, 6.5 Weatherby RPM all fit into that category. The 264 Win Mag, 26 Nosler, 6.5 300 are all a step above that. They'll throw that 140 grain bullet at 3,000 plus feet per second. Now I'm going to throw a couple of the max point blank ranges of several of these cartridges back out there again to further emphasize a point. So 6.5 Swede will have max point blank range, 281 yards. Remember, 8-inch diameter target. That's with that traditional 140 grain soft point bullet. That extends to 310 yards with the 143 grain bond strike bullet. 6.5 Grendel, 289 yards. 6.5 Creedmoor, 307. 6.5 PRC, 336 yards. 6.5 Weatherby RPM, 357 yards. 26 Nosler, 376 yards. 6.5 300 Weatherby, 382 yards. So you compare the very old 6.5 by 55 Swede with a traditional plain Jane 140 grain soft point bullet to the massive 6.5 300 Weatherby that has a much larger case, uses a lot more powder, has a lot more muzzle blast, more recoil, correspondingly less barrel life. All of that results in this Weatherby cartridge having about 100 additional yards of a max point blank range. Now, these other newer cartridges, to include the 6.5 by 300 Weatherby, certainly have other advantages over some of these older cartridges like the 6.5 Swede. So max point blank range doesn't tell the whole story. But there's also a reason why cartridges in that performance window of the 6.5 Swede, to include the 260 Remington, the 6.5 Creedmoor, etc., all perform so darn well. And that, in turn, I think also explains why the 6.5 millimeter bore diameter has come from being virtually unused in North America to being one of the most popular bore diameters in use here. We in North America, especially in the United States, were really late to the 6.5 millimeter party, but we did eventually figure it out. We figured out the same lesson that the Europeans learned practically a century earlier. Better late than never, I say, though. Now, if you enjoyed the 6.5 millimeter bore diameter roll-up, I encourage you to listen to the other episodes I have released in the past on other bore diameters. 25 caliber, 270 caliber, 7 millimeter, 30 caliber, 338 caliber, 35 caliber, 9.3 millimeter, and 375 caliber, all of the 40 caliber Safari cartridges, and the really big bore 50, 60, and 70 caliber Safari cartridges. I've done episodes on all of them over the last couple years. Links to all of those episodes are in the episode description. Now that I've done 6.5 millimeter, I've almost covered all my bases. I still have 22 caliber left, same with 6 millimeter / 243 caliber. I also need to do an 8mm / 32 caliber episode and non-Safari cartridge 40 caliber episode. All of those are coming, don't worry. Now, I've put links in the episode description to where you can purchase a couple of the books I referenced in this episode, like that Stephen Hunter book talking about the Kennedy assassination. Same thing with Richard Mann's book on rifle cartridges for the hunter, stuff like that. I've also put a link in the episode description to where you can support me on Patreon. Check out that post I made there talking about analyzing the terminal ballistics of the Kennedy assassination, and you'll also get access to all of the other posts I have made there as well. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and I can help. Thanks for listening. I'll see you back here next week on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.